The silence arrived first. It was not merely an absence of sound, but a presence of its own, a heavy, suffocating blanket thrown over the breathing forest. One moment, the late August night in the Serpentine National Forest was alive with the chittering of insects and the distant call of a lone owl. The next, it was as if the world had been muted, plunged into a profound and unnatural vacuum. The Peterson family, clustered around the dying embers of their campfire, felt it in their bones. John Peterson, a man who built his life on the predictable certainties of physics and engineering, felt the fine hairs on his arms stand on end. His wife, Sarah, an artist attuned to the subtle shifts in mood and atmosphere, instinctively pulled their two children closer. 14-year-old Leo, who had been trying to map constellations with a new stargazing app, looked up from his phone to find it dead, its screen a blank black mirror. 9-year-old Maya simply stared into the impenetrable darkness beyond the ring of firelight, her small face a mask of placid curiosity. The fire itself, a moment ago a cheerful dance of orange and red, sputtered and shrank, its flames turning a sickly, anemic blue before winking out, leaving only a faint pulsing glow from the coals. They were plunged into a darkness so absolute it felt physical, a liquid void that swallowed the familiar shapes of the trees in their tent. Then the hum began. It was not a sound that entered the ears, but a vibration that resonated deep within the chest cavity, a low-frequency thrum that seemed to shake the very marrow of their bones. It was a pressure, a physical weight in the air that made it difficult to breathe, to think. And with the hum came the light. It started as a pinprick, a single, impossibly bright star directly above their small clearing, where no star should have been. It did not twinkle. It did not move with the gentle grace of a satellite. It pulsed, a slow, deliberate heartbeat of pure, sterile white light that seemed to bleach the color from the night. John's mind, a fortress of logic and reason, began to crumble. He thought of landing lights, of a helicopter, but there was no rotor wash, no thundering engine, only that deafening silence and the bone-jarring hum. The light intensified, growing from a point to a disk, descending with a slow, majestic indifference. It was not falling, it was arriving. As it grew larger, its luminescence cast the forest in a stark, monochromatic tableau. The towering pines became jagged silhouettes, their needles rendered in hyper-detailed shades of gray and black. The shadows it cast were wrong, moving in ways that defied the single light source, stretching and contracting like living things. What descends from the sky when the world is asleep? What watches from the silent, patient darkness above a remote wilderness far from the prying eyes of civilization? For the Peterson family, these were no longer abstract questions for late-night speculation. They were a terrifying, unfolding reality. They were no longer campers enjoying a final summer retreat. They were specimens, caught in the stark analytical glare of something utterly alien. The light was now directly over the clearing, a vast circular effulgence that blotted out the real stars. From its center, a second light emerged, a narrow, coherent beam of pale, ethereal blue. It did not flare out as it descended. It was a perfect column, a pillar of shimmering particles that moved with a terrifying, intelligent purpose. It swept across the forest floor, not illuminating it, but seeming to analyze it, to taste it. The beam touched a fern, and the fronds curled and withered, turning a brittle, papery brown in an instant. It swept over a patch of damp moss, and steam hissed into the cold night air as every drop of moisture was instantly vaporized. Then the beam stopped. It stopped directly over the cold, dead heart of their campfire pit, a mere 20 feet from where the family huddled, paralyzed. The silence was broken by a sound, a series of soft, melodic tones that seemed to emanate from the light itself, a language of pure mathematics and geometry. And in that moment, as they stared into the heart of the impossible, the Peterson family understood a singular, terrible truth. They were not alone. And whatever was with them in that clearing was not from their world. The very fabric of their reality, the comfortable, predictable world they had known just minutes before, was being unraveled, thread by terrifying thread, under the silent, watchful gaze of an intelligence that defied all comprehension. The night was no longer theirs. The forest was no longer theirs. They were trespassers in a place that had just been claimed by another. 48 hours earlier, the world had been a place of comforting routine and logical progression. John Peterson, a structural engineer for a prominent Seattle firm, had meticulously planned this trip for months. For him, it was an exercise in optimization, a perfect escape from the concrete and steel that defined his days. He had charted the course, calculated fuel consumption, and packed their SUV with a Tetris-like precision that was both a source of pride for him and gentle amusement for his family. He was a man who believed in blueprints, in stress tolerances, and in the immutable laws of physics. The universe, in his view, was a complex but ultimately understandable machine. He sought the wilderness not for its mystery, but for its predictable, cyclical beauty, a system he could appreciate and navigate. Sarah Peterson viewed the world through a different lens. An abstract painter, she saw the world not as a collection of objects and forces, but as a tapestry of light, color, and emotion. Where John saw geological strata in a cliff face, she saw layers of time and memory. She was drawn to the Serpentine National Forest not for the challenge of navigating its trails, but for the promise of its untamed, chaotic beauty. She hoped the deep greens and misty blues of the ancient woods would seep into her subconscious, providing new forms and palettes for her work. For Sarah, the universe was not a machine to be understood, but a poem to be felt. Their children were a perfect synthesis of their parents' worldviews. Leo, at 14, was his father's son, armed with a new telescope and a deep fascination with the cosmos. He devoured books on astrophysics and spent his nights charting the predictable paths of planets and satellites. He saw the universe as a grand puzzle, and he was eager to find its missing pieces. 9-year-old Maya was her mother's daughter. She carried a well-worn sketchbook and a set of colored pencils, her mission to capture the faces she saw in the gnarled bark of ancient trees and the fleeting shapes of clouds. For her, the forest was a fairy tale, a place of magic and secrets waiting to be discovered. Their destination, the Serpentine National Forest, was itself a place of profound duality. By day, it was a jewel of the Pacific Northwest, a sprawling expanse of old-growth timber, crystalline lakes, and mist-shrouded peaks that drew thousands of hikers and campers each year. But by night, it held a different reputation. The forest was a place of deep and abiding strangeness, a window area in the parlance of those who study the unexplained. The indigenous tribes who had lived on this land for millennia spoke of the sky people, beings who would descend in silent canoes of light to walk among the trees. Their stories were not of gods, but of visitors, of powerful but tangible beings who treated the forest as their own sovereign territory. As the 20th century progressed, the old legends were replaced by new ones. Loggers and prospectors in the 1950s and 60s filed hushed reports of strange, silent lights that would pace their vehicles along lonely logging roads. In the 1970s, a small aircraft vanished without a trace while flying over the forest's central massif, an area the locals had nicknamed the Serpentine Triangle. No wreckage was ever found. Park rangers, a pragmatic and tight-lipped group, would occasionally share stories over beers in the small towns bordering the park, tales of malfunctioning compasses, disorienting fogs that would appear on clear days, and an unnerving number of hikers who would vanish from well-marked trails, only to reappear days later, miles from where they were last seen, with no memory of the intervening time. The Petersons, of course, knew none of this. To them, the Serpentine was simply a name on a map, a destination recommended on a popular camping blog. As they drove deeper into its verdant embrace, leaving the highways for winding state roads and finally for the gravel access lanes of the national park, they felt only a sense of liberation. The air grew cleaner, scented with pine and damp earth. The endless canopy of Douglas fir and western hemlock swallowed the sky, dappling the road ahead in a shifting mosaic of light and shadow. To John, it was a welcome retreat into simplicity. To Sarah, it was an immersion in sublime beauty. To Leo, it was a chance to see the stars free from the light pollution of the city. And to Maya, it was the opening chapter of a grand adventure. They were an ordinary family, seeking an ordinary escape. They could not have known they were driving toward a boundary, a place where the map of the known world ends, and where the legends are not just stories, but warnings. The forest was waiting for them, ancient and patient, holding its secrets in the deep shadows beneath its canopy. And in the silent, cold depths of space, something else was waiting too. The first 24 hours at their campsite by the edge of Whisper Lake were idyllic, almost unnervingly perfect. John, with practiced efficiency, had the main tent and a smaller one for the children erected in under an hour. Sarah laid out a blanket and began to sketch the way the late afternoon sun fractured through the surface of the impossibly clear water. Leo assembled his telescope on a small, flat rock outcropping, eagerly anticipating the celestial show that nightfall would bring. Maya, sketchbook in hand, wandered near the edge of the woods, documenting the intricate patterns of moss on a fallen log. The air was still, the water like glass. It was the picture of tranquility, the very image of the escape they had craved. Yet, as the sun began its slow descent behind the jagged western peaks, a subtle wrongness began to creep into the periphery of their perfect family portrait. It began with the silence, not the sudden absolute vacuum that would later precede the main event, but a gradual tapering off of the natural world. The birdsong that had filled the afternoon air ceased abruptly. The usual chorus of frogs from the lakeshore failed to begin its nightly performance. Even the constant low-level hum of insects seemed to have been switched off. Leo was the first to voice a specific anomaly. As dusk bled into true night, he sat hunched over his telescope, his brow furrowed in concentration. "That's weird," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. John, poking at the newly lit campfire, looked over. "What's up, champ?" Leo pointed toward a patch of sky near the Big Dipper. "See that star? The really bright one? It's not on my chart." John squinted, following his son's finger. "Probably just a satellite, Leo. Lots of them up there." "No, it's not moving like a satellite," Leo insisted. "Satellites move in a straight line. This one, it was just sitting there, and then it just blinked out." John chuckled, clapping his son on the shoulder. "Atmospheric distortion. Or maybe your app needs an update. Don't worry about it. Let's get some marshmallows toasted." He dismissed it with the casual confidence of a man who had an explanation for everything, but Sarah, watching her son's frustrated face, felt a small, cold knot tighten in her stomach. The feeling of being watched, a primal instinct she had at first dismissed as city dwellers' paranoia, returned with a new intensity. The woods no longer felt merely quiet, they felt observant. Later, as she tucked Maya into her sleeping bag in the smaller tent, she noticed her daughter's latest drawing. Maya had filled an entire page not with the lake or the trees, but with tall, impossibly thin figures. They were rendered in black and gray pencil, stick-like beings with elongated limbs and large dark ovals for heads. They stood half hidden behind the trees at the edge of the clearing, their forms barely distinguishable from the vertical lines of the trunks. "Who are these, sweetie?" Sarah asked, her voice softer than she intended. "The quiet men," Maya said simply, her eyes already heavy with sleep. "They were watching me from the trees." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She looked from the drawing to the dark, silent wall of forest that encircled their camp. She saw nothing but shadows and moonlight. "You have such a wonderful imagination," she said, forcing a smile as she kissed her daughter's forehead. But the image of the quiet men was burned into her mind. It was a child's fantasy, of course, the product of a new, spooky environment. And yet it resonated with the unsettling stillness of the woods, with the strange, unmoving star Leo had seen, with the growing sense that they were intruders in a place that did not want them there. The feeling was compounded by a faint, almost imperceptible metallic taste in the air, a chemical tang that reminded Sarah of ozone after a thunderstorm, but there were no clouds in the sky. The stars were brilliant, scattered across the black velvet of the night with a clarity they never saw in the city. John, ever the pragmatist, was oblivious to the creeping dread. He was in his element, providing for his family, master of his small, temporary domain. He pointed out constellations to Leo, his explanations for cosmic distances and stellar evolution, a comforting balm of rationality against the encroaching strangeness. But even he couldn't help but notice the unusual cold that was settling in, a damp, penetrating chill that seemed to emanate not from the air, but from the ground itself. The fire, which he had built into a healthy blaze, seemed to offer little warmth beyond its immediate perimeter. The light it cast seemed weak, pushing back the oppressive darkness by only a few feet. They were an island of fragile light and warmth in an ocean of cold, silent shadow. The first night passed without further incident, but the sense of unease lingered. When they awoke, they found a thick, unnatural mist blanketing the clearing, clinging to the ground even as the morning sun began to burn brightly overhead. It was a strange, low-lying fog that swirled around their ankles and dissipated with an odd reluctance. They dismissed it as a normal lakeside phenomenon, made their breakfast, and spent the day hiking a well-marked trail. But the feeling of being observed never truly left them. They felt it in the woods, a constant, unseen pressure at their backs. They heard no other hikers, saw no other signs of life. It was as if they were the only people in the entire forest. That evening, as they prepared for their second night, the atmosphere grew even heavier, charged with a palpable tension. The quiet returned, deeper and more profound than the night before. This time, even John felt it. He found himself scanning the dark tree line, an inexplicable sense of apprehension making him double-check the locks on the car and ensure the camp knives were close at hand. He didn't know what he was preparing for, but the engineer in him was responding to a stress on the system, an invisible variable that was throwing all his calculations into disarray. The stage was being set. The ordinary world was receding, and the veil between what they knew and what they could not possibly imagine was growing terrifyingly thin. The second night began much like the first, with the family gathered around the fire. John was attempting to lighten the mood, telling a story from his own childhood camping trips, his voice a little too loud in the profound stillness. Sarah sat slightly apart, nursing a cup of tea, her gaze fixed on the dark, unmoving surface of Whisper Lake. Leo had abandoned his telescope, the previous night's anomaly leaving him more frustrated than curious. He was instead trying to get a signal on a small, hand-cranked emergency radio, turning the dial through crackles of static, finding nothing but dead air. Maya was quietly roasting a marshmallow, her focus absolute, a small island of innocence in a sea of rising tension. It happened at precisely 9:47 p.m. Leo would remember the time because he had just glanced at his digital watch a moment before it went blank. The temperature, which had been cool, plummeted. It was not a gradual drop, but an instantaneous shift, as if a freezer door had been thrown open on the world. The air grew sharp and brittle, their breath pluming in thick white clouds. Simultaneously, every piece of electronic equipment they possessed died. Leo's watch, John's smartphone, Sarah's digital camera, the LED lantern hanging from a branch, and the faint static from the emergency radio all ceased to function at the exact same instant. The silence that followed was absolute. But the most alarming event was what happened to the fire. The cheerful blaze, which John had just fed with a large piece of dry pine, did not just die down, it was extinguished. The flames seemed to be sucked downward, collapsing into the logs with a soft, final whoosh. One moment, there was a roaring fire. The next, only a pile of faintly glowing embers, pulsing with a weak residual heat. A collective gasp escaped the family. John, his rational mind scrambling for an explanation, a sudden downdraft, a freak pocket of oxygen-deprived air, stood up and stared at the dead fire, then at the dead lantern. Nothing made sense. The laws of combustion and electronics had been summarily suspended. And then the hum began. It started at the lowest register of human hearing, a subsonic vibration that traveled through the soles of their feet, up their legs, and into their chests. It was a physical force, a pressure wave that made their teeth ache and their stomachs churn. It was the sound of immense power, held in perfect, terrifying check. The family froze, their individual anxieties coalescing into a single, shared terror. Their eyes darted around the clearing, searching for a source, for anything that could explain the cascade of impossible events. And that's when they saw it. High above the jagged ridge on the far side of the lake, a light appeared. It was not the ambiguous star-like point from the previous night. This was a brilliant, self-luminous orb, the size of a full moon, that pulsed with a soft, rhythmic cadence. It bathed the entire valley in a cold, sterile blue-white light, a light that seemed to have no warmth, a light that seemed to strip the world of color, rendering it in stark monochrome. It was utterly silent, no engine noise, no rotor wash, nothing to connect it to any known human technology. It hung there for what felt like an eternity, a silent, glowing eye in the sky, observing them. John felt a wave of vertigo. His mind, which had been a bulwark of logic, was now a maelstrom of confusion and fear. This was not a helicopter. This was not a weather balloon. This was not a flare. Every rational explanation he could grasp it dissolved in the face of the impossible reality hanging in the sky. The orb began to move. It did not fly in any conventional sense. It moved with a preternatural smoothness, gliding across the sky towards their position. It crossed the entire expanse of the lake in a matter of seconds, its movement frictionless, utterly silent. As it drew closer, its sheer scale became terrifyingly apparent. This was not a small drone or remote probe. It was vast. The light seemed to be emanating from the bottom of a much larger, darker shape, a form that was only just visible against the starfield it was slowly eclipsing. The pace of the narrative of their lives had just accelerated to a terrifying velocity. The slow, creeping dread of the past day had erupted into a full-blown, high-stakes confrontation with the unknown. The hum intensified, the pressure in the air becoming almost unbearable. It felt as if the atmosphere itself was being compressed. Maya began to cry, not a loud wail, but a series of soft, terrified sobs. Sarah wrapped her arms around both children, turning their faces away from the approaching light and burying them in her jacket, as if she could physically shield them from the sheer wrongness of what was happening. But John could not look away. He was transfixed, his engineer's mind locked in a battle between disbelief and the undeniable sensory data being fed to his brain. He was a witness to an event that his entire education, his entire worldview, told him could not be happening. The object stopped directly overhead. It was so close now that it filled their entire field of vision, a colossal geometric shape that blotted out the sky. The light from its underside was no longer a diffuse glow, but an intense, directed beam that illuminated their small clearing with the brilliance of a surgical lamp. The silence was absolute, save for the incessant, bone-deep hum and Maya's muffled sobs. They were caught, pinned, exposed. The prelude was over. The performance was about to begin. The single brilliant orb of light that had transfixed them was revealed to be merely the apex of a far larger, far more terrifying structure. As it settled into a fixed position directly above their campsite, its full form resolved against the night sky. It was a perfect equilateral triangle, a colossal wedge of impossible blackness. Its scale was staggering. Each side of the craft must have been hundreds of feet long, dwarfing the clearing and the surrounding ancient pines. The surface of the object was a material unlike any John had ever conceived. It was not metal, not composite, not any known substance. It was a matte, featureless black that did not reflect the light from its own underbelly, but seemed to swallow it. There were no seams, no rivets, no panels, no visible means of propulsion. It was as if it had been carved from a single piece of solidified night. At each of the three corners, a soft, white light pulsed in a slow, hypnotic, unsynchronized rhythm. In the center, where the brilliant light had first appeared, the source was a circular aperture that glowed with a fierce internal energy. It was from this central point that the next phase of the encounter began. The humming vibration, which had been a constant oppressive presence, suddenly ceased. In its place, an even more profound silence fell, a silence so complete it created a painful pressure in their ears. Then, a new light emerged from the central aperture. It was not the broad, diffuse glow from before, but a focused, coherent beam of pale, shimmering blue. It was not a solid cone of light like a searchlight. It was a column of what looked like millions of tiny, swirling particles of light, a pillar of luminous dust that descended with a slow, deliberate purpose. The beam was impossibly straight, its edges defined with geometric precision. It did not illuminate the objects it passed through. It seemed to pass through them. As it descended, it moved with a terrifying intelligence. It swept across the ground, not in a random pattern, but in a grid-like search. The family watched, paralyzed with a primal fear that bypassed all rational thought as the beam touched the edge of the lake. There was no splash, no reflection. The water directly under the beam simply seemed to vanish, replaced for a moment by a churning void before the surrounding lake rushed in to fill it. The beam drifted over to their tent. The nylon fabric did not burn or melt. It seemed to become momentarily transparent, the sleeping bags and folded clothes inside visible in stark, ghostly detail, as if the tent were being X-rayed by an alien technology. Then the beam stopped. It came to rest on the circle of dead, dehydrated ground where their campfire had been, a space no more than 15 feet from where they were huddled together. The pillar of blue light held its position, and the air around it began to shimmer, distorting like a heat haze on a summer road, yet the air remained intensely cold. John felt his scientific mind, his last bastion of sanity, finally break. The laws of thermodynamics, of optics, of physics itself were not just being bent, they were being shattered. He was witnessing a demonstration of power so far beyond human comprehension that it felt like a form of magic or madness. It was at this moment that the family experienced what investigators would later call a dissociative state or altered perception. The world around them began to feel unreal. The sharp edges of their fear softened into a strange, detached awe. The sounds of Maya's crying faded into the background, as if coming from a great distance. They felt a profound sense of temporal distortion. Seconds stretched into minutes, and minutes seemed to pass in the blink of an eye. Sarah would later describe it as feeling like she was watching a film of her own life, a passive observer to an event she had no control over. John felt a strange sense of communication, not in words or images, but in a direct telepathic infusion of pure information. He felt an overwhelming sense of age, of an intelligence that was ancient beyond human imagining. He perceived concepts of multidimensional geometry and nonlinear time that his mind could not grasp, but that he understood on some deeper intuitive level. It was a feeling of being intellectually and spiritually dwarfed, of being a microbe under the microscope of a god. The blue column of light pulsed, and a new sound emerged, a series of complex interlocking chimes, like a celestial wind chime playing a mathematical formula. The ground beneath the beam began to glow, the soil and rock becoming faintly translucent. They could see the network of roots beneath the surface, the layers of earth and stone, all laid bare by this impossible energy. The craft above them remained utterly, unnervingly still and silent, a monument of alien geometry hanging in their sky. They were trapped in a bubble of distorted reality, their world remade by the silent, inexorable will of the visitors. The fear had not vanished, but it had been joined by something else, a profound, terrifying wonder. They were witnessing a miracle, a violation of the natural order so profound that it would forever divide their lives into two distinct parts, the time before the light and the time after. In that moment, frozen in the cold blue glare of the unknown, the Peterson family was irrevocably changed, their souls seared by a fire not of this world. The apex of the encounter was not a crescendo of noise or a flash of blinding light, but a moment of profound and chilling intimacy. As the column of blue light pulsed over the dead campfire, the family felt a collective sensation, a shared mental intrusion. It was not a voice, but a feeling, a wave of pure, unadulterated curiosity directed at them. It was cold, analytical, and utterly devoid of emotion. It was the feeling of being examined, cataloged, and understood on a level far deeper than physical observation. John felt his entire life flash before his eyes, not as a linear memory, but as a simultaneous data stream. His childhood, his education, his career, his love for his family, all of it accessed and processed in an instant. Sarah felt her artistic sensibilities, her emotions, her dreams, laid bare and scrutinized. The children, too, were touched by it. Leo's fascination with the cosmos was met with an impression of true, unimaginable scale, a vision of galaxies and nebulae that made his astronomical chart seem like a child's crayon drawing. Maya, who had been sobbing in terror, suddenly fell silent. Her eyes, wide and unfocused, stared at the shimmering blue pillar. She later claimed she saw the quiet men from her drawing, not in the woods, but within the light itself, beckoning to her. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The column of blue light retracted back into the central aperture with the speed of a camera shutter closing. The melodic chimes ceased. The aperture itself seemed to contract, the fierce light within it dimming until it was just another part of the impossibly black hull. For a single, heart-stopping moment, the colossal triangular craft hung there in absolute silence and darkness, a hole in the fabric of the night sky. Then it vanished. It did not accelerate into the distance. It did not shoot upwards into space. It was simply there one instant and gone the next. There was no flash, no sound, no ripple in the air. It was a perfect and absolute departure, as if it had never been there at all. The sudden absence of the object was as shocking as its presence had been. The stars it had obscured rushed back into view. The oppressive weight in the atmosphere lifted. And then the sounds of the forest returned, not gradually, but all at once, in a deafening wave. The crickets, the frogs, the wind in the pines, it was as if someone had turned the volume of the world from 0 to 10 in a single moment. The shock of the returning normality was so great that Sarah cried out. Leo's dead watch flickered and came back to life, its display reading 9:51 p.m. Only 4 minutes had passed, 4 minutes that had felt like a lifetime, an eternity. The LED lantern hanging from the tree flickered on, casting a weak, familiar yellow light over the scene. John, his limbs feeling like lead, stumbled over to the fire pit. He reached for the emergency lighter, his hands shaking so violently he could barely operate it. With a click and a spark, he held the flame to the kindling. It caught instantly, roaring back to life with a ferocity that seemed to defy the damp, cold air. The family huddled around the reborn fire, seeking not just its warmth, its familiarity, its connection to the world they knew. They didn't speak. There were no words to describe what they had just experienced. They simply held each other, shivering, their eyes wide with shock and a terror that was only just beginning to settle into their bones. They remained that way for hours, watching the flames, flinching at every gust of wind, every snap of a twig in the surrounding darkness. The forest was no longer a place of beauty and escape. It was a place of menace, a place with a terrible secret. Sleep was impossible. As the first faint hint of dawn began to gray the eastern sky, John, driven by a desperate need for tangible proof, for something his rational mind could hold on to, took a flashlight and walked cautiously toward the center of the clearing. What he found there confirmed that the night's events had not been a shared hallucination. In the exact spot where the blue pillar of light had hovered, there was a perfect circle, roughly 10 feet in diameter. The grass and soil within this circle were not burned, but desiccated. Every blade of grass was a brittle gray husk that crumbled to dust at his touch. The ground itself was dry and powdery, all moisture seemingly baked out of it, yet it was cold to the touch. Around the clearing, on the bark of the trees and on the surface of their tent, they found a strange, gelatinous residue. It was clear and odorless, and it evaporated within minutes of the sun's first rays touching it, leaving behind no trace. Most chilling of all, near the edge of the woods, were 3 large, deep impressions in the soft, damp earth. They formed the points of a perfect equilateral triangle, each impression a circular pad, as if some colossal, heavy tripod had rested there. The evidence was undeniable. Something had been there, something massive, heavy, and technologically advanced beyond comprehension. The panic that had been held at bay by shock and darkness now took hold. There was no discussion. No plan was needed. With frantic, uncoordinated movements, they began to tear down their camp. Tents were ripped from their stakes, sleeping bags were stuffed into sacks, and equipment was thrown haphazardly into the back of the SUV. They left behind a half-cooked breakfast, a camp chair, and any semblance of the peaceful vacation they had planned. As John started the engine, the family took one last look at the clearing by Whisper Lake. It looked serene again in the morning light, almost mocking them with its placid beauty. But for them, it would forever be a place of cosmic horror, the site of a wound, in their reality that would never fully heal. They fled the Serpentine National Forest, as if escaping the scene of a crime, their tires kicking up gravel, their faces pale with a terror that would haunt their days and shatter their nights for years to come. The story of the Peterson family's ordeal might have ended there, a traumatic memory locked away and dismissed as a shared nightmare, were it not for a series of small, seemingly unrelated events. The first was a phone call made by a veteran park ranger named Dave Hackett. 2 days after the Petersons fled the forest, Hackett, on a routine patrol, discovered their abandoned campsite near Whisper Lake. He found the discarded camp chair and the still smoldering remains of a hastily extinguished fire. What truly caught his attention, however, were the ground markings. The perfectly circular patch of desiccated earth and the 3 massive impressions forming a triangle were unlike anything he had seen in his 30 years of service. He knew it wasn't a lightning strike, which leaves a distinct branching pattern. He knew it wasn't a prank. The sheer scale of the impressions suggested immense weight. Hackett, a man who had heard all the strange stories the Serpentine had to offer, quietly documented the site with his personal camera and made a call. The call was not to his superiors, whom he knew would dismiss it, but to a man named Marcus Thorne. Marcus Thorne was a name whispered in circles that dealt with the fringe, the unexplained, and the censored. Once a respected investigative journalist for a major national newspaper, Thorne had seen his career derailed after he pursued a story about anomalous radar returns and pilot testimonies connected to a naval fleet exercise. His insistence on the validity of the data, in the face of official denials and ridicule from his peers, had cost him his job and his reputation. Undeterred, he had founded a small independent online publication called the Anomaly Archives, a platform dedicated to the meticulous evidence-based investigation of phenomena that mainstream science and media refused to touch. He was not a wild-eyed believer, but a hardened skeptic who had seen too much to maintain his disbelief. Thorne listened to Ranger Hackett's hushed description with a practiced, analytical calm. The details, the electronic failure, the silent triangular craft, the physical ground traces, were all chillingly familiar. They were hallmarks of a specific, recurring type of close encounter, one that was often reported but rarely substantiated with such promising physical evidence. Within hours, Thorne was in his car, driving north toward the Serpentine National Forest. He arrived at the Whisper Lake campsite less than 72 hours after the event. The site was already beginning to degrade. Rain had softened the edges of the triangular impressions, and new growth was starting to poke through the desiccated circle. But the evidence was still there. Thorne worked with the precision of a crime scene investigator. He photographed everything from multiple angles, with scales for reference. He took measurements of the distance between the impressions, the diameter of the circle, and the depth of the indentations. He carefully collected soil samples from within the circle, from the impressions, and from a control area outside the affected zone, sealing them in sterile bags. He scraped a small amount of a sticky residual substance he found clinging to the underside of a fern near the circle, a remnant of the gelatinous material the family had seen. His most crucial task, however, was finding the witnesses. Using the campsite reservation records which Hackett discreetly provided, Thorne found the name, Peterson. Tracing them to a Seattle address was a matter of public record, but getting them to talk would be another matter entirely. He found the Petersons a week later, holed up in their suburban home, the curtains drawn, the phone unanswered. When Thorne appeared at their door, identifying himself as an independent journalist, John's first instinct was to slam it in his face. The family was traumatized, terrified of ridicule, and desperate to forget. But Thorne was not a tabloid reporter seeking a sensational headline. He spoke with a quiet empathy, his demeanor serious and respectful. He didn't ask them if they had seen a UFO. He asked them about the electronic failures, about the drop in temperature, about the strange silence. He presented them with his own knowledge of similar cases, letting them know they were not alone, that what they had experienced, as terrifying and bizarre as it was part of a larger, documented pattern. It was this approach, this validation of their experience, that finally broke through John's wall of fear and denial. In a long, difficult interview that stretched late into the night, the Petersons recounted their story. Thorne listened, recorded, and cross-referenced their timelines. He noted the consistency in their accounts, the shared sensory details, and the profound psychological impact the event had clearly had on each of them. Sarah described the feeling of being mentally scrutinized. Leo spoke of the impossible speed and silence of the object. And little Maya, in a quiet, halting voice, told Thorne about the quiet men in her drawing and in the blue light. For Thorne, this was the case he had been waiting for. Credible, articulate witnesses combined with tangible physical evidence. The Peterson encounter was not just another story of lights in the sky. It was a direct physical interaction, a close encounter of the second and possibly third kind. The investigation had just begun, but Thorne already knew he was standing on the edge of a profound mystery, a mystery that the authorities would almost certainly try to bury. And he was determined to bring it into the light. With the Peterson family's testimony secured and the physical samples from the site in his possession, Marcus Thorne shifted his investigation into its next phase, confronting the official narrative. He knew from experience that for any event of this magnitude, particularly one occurring near sensitive military airspace, there would be a story. It would be a story designed to be plausible, dismissive, and above all, to close the case. His first step was a formal inquiry with the local sheriff's department. He requested any and all reports filed for the night in question concerning unusual lights or disturbances in the vicinity of the Serpentine National Forest. The initial response was a clerk telling him there were no such reports. But Thorne was persistent. Citing specific public records laws, he pressed further. A week later, he received a copy of a preliminary report filed by a deputy who had been on duty that night. The report was a bombshell. It mentioned multiple civilian calls, starting at approximately 9:45 p.m., reporting a series of bright, silent lights moving in a highly unusual, non-linear fashion over the area of Whisper Lake. The deputy himself had noted observing a large, dark, triangular object moving silently overhead before it vanished abruptly. However, stapled to this preliminary document was an addendum, a final report signed by the sheriff himself. This new version completely contradicted the first. It stated that the calls were the result of a misidentification of a scheduled military training exercise from the nearby Redwood Mountain Air Station. The deputy's own sighting was reclassified as atmospheric clutter and a trick of the light. The case was officially closed. The alteration of the report was a glaring red flag. Thorne knew he was on the right track. His next move was to file a Freedom of Information Act, FOIA request with the Department of Defense, specifically targeting Redwood Mountain Air Station. He requested all flight logs, radar data, and exercise schedules for the night of the Peterson encounter. The response, when it finally came months later, was a masterclass in bureaucratic obfuscation. The vast majority of his request was denied, citing reasons of national security. However, they did provide a single heavily redacted public statement. It confirmed that a routine training exercise had indeed been conducted that night, involving the use of high-intensity, parachute-borne illumination flares. This, the statement concluded, accounted for any and all civilian sightings of unusual lights. The explanation was neat, tidy, and utterly inadequate. Thorne began to pick it apart piece by piece. Flares, even high-intensity military ones, do not hang silently in the sky. They do not move in controlled non-linear patterns against the wind. They do not form a colossal solid triangular shape that blots out the stars. They certainly do not cause widespread electromagnetic failure, draining batteries and disabling electronics in a localized area. And most importantly, flares do not land, leaving behind massive triangular impressions and a perfect circle of desiccated earth. The official story was a cover, and a flimsy one at that. It was designed not to convince an expert, but to placate the public and dismiss the curious. While waiting for the FOIA response, Thorne had sent the samples he had collected to a trusted independent laboratory run by a PhD chemist who owed him a favor. The results that came back were stunning and provided the scientific backbone to the Petersons' incredible story. The soil from inside the desiccated circle showed evidence of intense microwave irradiation, far beyond any natural source or conventional human technology. The isotopic ratios of certain elements in the soil were anomalous, suggesting exposure to a powerful energy field that had altered them at a subatomic level. But the most startling discovery came from the gelatinous residue Thorne had scraped from the fern. The lab's report was blunt. The substance was of unknown origin. It contained complex long-chain polymers and protein-like structures, but its composition did not match any known terrestrial biological or synthetic compound. It was, for all intents and purposes, alien. Now, Thorne had a complete picture. Credible eyewitness testimony from an entire family, physical trace evidence showing immense weight and geometric precision, and laboratory analysis confirming exposure to extreme energy and the presence of non-terrestrial materials. And standing against all of this was a transparently false official story about military flares and a doctored sheriff's report. The conspiracy was not a theory. It was a documented fact. The authorities were not just mistaken, they were actively lying. The question was no longer what the Peterson family had seen. The question was why it was being so desperately covered up. Was it to prevent public panic, or was it to protect a secret far more profound, either a secret of our own, a black-budget technology so advanced it is indistinguishable from the alien or the secret of another's, a silent, ongoing presence on our planet that operates with impunity, its motives and origins a complete and terrifying mystery. Thorne knew he was walking a dangerous line, piecing together a puzzle that powerful forces wanted to remain scattered. The data Marcus Thorne had assembled painted a picture that was both breathtaking and deeply unsettling. The Peterson case was no longer an isolated incident, but a key piece in a much larger, global mosaic of unexplained phenomena. The silent, black triangle was a recurring character in the modern mythology of the skies, a phantom that had been reported for decades by credible witnesses across every continent. Pilots had encountered them at high altitudes, military personnel had tracked them on radar performing impossible maneuvers, and ordinary citizens like the Petersons had seen them hovering silently over their homes and remote landscapes. Thorne began to cross-reference the specifics of the Peterson encounter with his extensive archives. The electromagnetic effects, the silent propulsion, the sheer scale, the physical ground traces. The pattern was undeniable. He found a case from Belgium in 1990 where two F-16 fighter jets were scrambled to intercept a similar triangular craft, only to have it outmaneuver them with accelerations that would have crushed any human pilot. He found a rash of sightings over Phoenix, Arizona in 1997, where thousands of people witnessed a mile-wide V-shaped object drift silently over the city. He found reports from rural Australia, from the remote valleys of Norway, and from the desolate plains of Argentina. In almost every case, the official explanation was the same: misidentified conventional aircraft, flares, weather phenomena, or mass hysteria. Always plausible, always dismissive, always a dead end. But what did it all mean? Thorne explored the two dominant and wildly divergent theories. The first was the terrestrial hypothesis. The black triangles were ours. They were the product of a deeply classified, black-budget military program, the next generation of stealth aircraft. Proponents pointed to the rumored TR-3B Astra, a speculative tactical reconnaissance vehicle supposedly developed at secretive facilities like Area 51. This theory suggested the craft used a revolutionary propulsion system, perhaps based on a mercury-based plasma vortex spun by a magnetic field disruptor, which would account for the silence, the humming, and the incredible maneuverability. In this scenario, the cover-up was designed to protect a technological advantage of unimaginable strategic importance. The Peterson family had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, accidentally stumbling upon a field test of America's most secret weapon. This explanation was compelling in its own way. It kept the phenomenon within the realm of the known, albeit the highly classified known. But it had holes. If this was a top-secret American craft, why were identical objects being seen all over the world in countries both allied and adversarial? And more pointedly, why would a test of such a vehicle involve terrorizing a family on a camping trip and performing what appeared to be a detailed environmental scan of a remote patch of forest? The actions seemed purposeless for a military test. The second theory was far more profound and far more disturbing: the extraterrestrial hypothesis. This theory proposed that the triangles were not ours at all. They were probes, drones, or manned vessels from an intelligence not of this world. In this context, the Serpentine National Forest was not just a random location, but a targeted one, perhaps for its specific geology, its biology, or for reasons utterly beyond our comprehension. The encounter was not an accident, but a deliberate act of surveillance or study. The analysis of the soil, the dehydration of the plants, the collection of the gelatinous residue, it all pointed to a scientific survey. The Petersons were simply part of the local fauna to be observed and cataloged. This theory accounted for the global nature of the sightings and the seemingly non-human intelligence behind the craft's movements. The government cover-up in this light became an act of either powerlessness or policy, a desperate attempt to prevent a global panic over a situation they had absolutely no control over. They were not protecting their own secret, they were hiding their own impotence in the face of a superior presence. While Thorne wrestled with these grand theories, the human cost of the encounter was playing out in the quiet desperation of the Peterson household. The trauma had settled deep into the family's psyche, fracturing their lives in different ways. John, the engineer, the man of logic, was the most visibly broken. He had lost his anchor to reality. He would spend hours in his study, surrounded by physics textbooks, trying and failing to reconcile what he had seen with the known laws of the universe. He suffered from severe insomnia and anxiety, unable to shake the feeling of being intellectually and physically violated. His work suffered, his confidence shattered. The universe was no longer a predictable machine, it was a haunted house, and he had seen the ghost. Sarah's art, once filled with vibrant colors and abstract hope, became dark and monochromatic. Her canvases were now filled with vast geometric shapes hanging in empty skies, with thin, spectral figures hiding in stark, shadowy forests. Her art became her only outlet for the terror and awe she could not put into words, a visual record of her encounter with the sublime and the terrible. The children were perhaps the most tragic victims. Leo, who had once dreamed of exploring the stars, now refused to go outside after dark. The night sky, once a source of wonder, was now a source of deep-seated dread. He had seen what was really up there, and it had terrified him. Maya, the youngest, became withdrawn and quiet. She stopped drawing altogether. She suffered from recurring nightmares, not of a monster or a scary animal, but of the quiet men, who she said would stand at the foot of her bed, watching her in silence. The Peterson family was adrift, their shared experience a secret that isolated them from the rest of the world, a trauma they could explain to no one. They were living ghosts in their own lives, haunted by 4 minutes of impossible reality in a dark forest. The file on the Peterson case, like so many files in Marcus Thorne's anomaly archive, remains open. There is no neat conclusion, no final revelation that ties all the loose threads together. There is only the stark contrast between a family's life-altering trauma and an official story that denies their very reality. The authorities, from the local sheriff up to the Department of Defense, have never deviated from their script. The lights were flares. The ground markings were a natural anomaly, perhaps a rare fungal bloom combined with a lightning strike. The electromagnetic effects were undocumented and therefore considered anecdotal. The Peterson family's testimony was deemed the product of stress and misperception, a story concocted after the fact to explain a frightening but ultimately conventional series of events. The physical evidence collected by Thorne, including the lab reports on the soil and the unidentifiable residue, has been systematically ignored or dismissed by mainstream scientific journals who refuse to consider data collected outside the strict peer-reviewed process, especially when it points to such an extraordinary conclusion. The evidence exists in a kind of limbo, too incredible for the establishment to accept, but too well documented for the investigator to dismiss. The Peterson family, seeking to reclaim some semblance of a normal life, eventually moved to a new city, changed their names, and cut off all contact with Marcus Thorne. They chose anonymity over the relentless, painful scrutiny that comes with being a public witness to the impossible. They live now as a family in exile, forever bonded by a secret that they can never share, carrying the weight of their knowledge like a physical burden. John, it is said, gave up engineering and now works as a carpenter, finding solace in the simple, tangible reality of wood and nails. Sarah never painted again. Their story serves as a chilling testament to the profound and lasting impact of such an encounter, a stark reminder that witnessing the unknown can be a wound from which one never fully recovers. Marcus Thorne, for his part, published his complete investigation on the Anomaly Archives. He laid out the timeline, the witness testimony, the photographs of the ground traces, and the full laboratory analysis. His article was read by thousands within the community of those who study these phenomena, another meticulously documented data point in the ever-growing mountain of evidence for a high-strangeness reality operating in the shadows of our own. To the wider world, it was just another UFO story on the internet, easily dismissed, easily forgotten. And so, the mystery endures, suspended in the space between what is proven and what is believed. The questions posed that night in the Serpentine National Forest echo still, unanswered. What was the true nature of the intelligence that guided the silent triangular craft? Was it human, the product of a secret so deep it is protected by a global conspiracy of denial? Or was it something else, an ancient non-human presence that treats our planet as its own laboratory, our skies as its own domain? What was its purpose in that remote clearing? Was it a simple act of geological or biological surveying? Was it a display of power, a warning, or a greeting? Or was it something far more inscrutable, an action whose motives are as alien to us as our own might be to an ant? We are left with the silence and the light, the silence of the authorities, in the face of credible evidence and the strange, cold light of an unknown technology that descended upon an ordinary family and shattered their world. The Peterson case is a stark reminder that the maps we have drawn of our reality may be incomplete. There are still vast uncharted territories, dark forests of the unknown where the old rules do not apply. And in these places, things are waiting, watching. What do you do when the impossible becomes your reality? When the sky opens up and reveals a truth so profound and terrifying, it invalidates everything you thought you knew. The Petersons chose to run, to hide, to forget. But the question lingers for the rest of us. If that silent triangular shadow were to fall over you in your backyard, on your lonely road, what would you do? Would you look away? Or would you dare to see what is really there, waiting in the darkness between the stars? The answers, it seems, are not forthcoming. We are left only with the stories, the evidence, and the unsettling feeling that we are not the masters of our own house. We may only be tenants, living on borrowed time under the silent, watchful gaze of the true landlords.